The hatch behind you closes with a sound too soft for what it means. No hinge creak, no slam, just a pressure change in your ears, and then quiet. Somewhere beneath your feet, a ring the size of a stadium starts turning, and weight comes back into your legs gradually, without ceremony. The way it left, the air filling your lungs right now was breathed by someone else an hour ago. It will be breathed by someone else an hour from now, for longer than any name aboard this ship is going to survive being remembered. You already know you're not coming back. What almost nobody tells you, standing at the hatch, is that coming back was never really the danger. The real danger is quieter than that, and it doesn't show up on any system's checklist. It shows up 3 generations from now, in someone who never chose to be here at all. This is what it would actually feel like. Physically, biologically, socially. To live inside a machine built to outlive you on its way to another star. Not the poster version, the version your body and your descendants would actually inherit if departure is the part of this story that actually interests you, not the arrival everyone else pictures. Subscribe. So, let's begin. Start with the number, because the number is the whole problem, and almost nobody sits with it long enough to feel its weight. The nearest star system that hosts a planet even plausibly capable of supporting life as we understand it is Proxima Centauri, and the world in question, Proxima Centauri b, sits about 4.22 light-years from where you're standing right now. Say the distance out loud and it sounds almost reasonable, almost close. 4, just 4, and a fraction. It's the kind of number that fits comfortably on one hand. Now unpack what a light-year actually is, because the word hides its own scale inside itself. Light is the fastest thing that exists. Nothing with mass, no ship, no probe, no bullet, no person will ever move faster than it. Not as a matter of engineering difficulty, but as a matter of the physical rules the universe runs on. And even light, moving at roughly 300,000 kilometers every single second, needs 4.22 full years to cross that gap. Not because light is being cautious, because that's how much space is actually in between. So, hold both numbers at once. The fastest possible thing in existence needs over 4 years just to make the crossing, one way, carrying nothing. Now ask what the fastest thing humanity has ever actually built could do with the same gap. You don't actually need a hypothetical to see how large that gap really is. Either, there's already a real answer, stated plainly by NASA itself. And it's worth sitting with before reaching for anything faster. Voyager 1, launched in 1977, has been moving outward, non-stop, faster than a speeding bullet, every single second since, and is now the most distant human-made object in existence. Already past the edge of the sun's direct influence, out in the space between stars. It travels at roughly 17 kilometers per second relative to the Sunday. A real, sustained cruise speed, not a peak or a dive. Point it directly at the nearest star and let it fly at that same speed, uninterrupted, and NASA's own published figure for the crossing comes out to more than 73,000 years. Here's the detail that actually lands the point. After very nearly 50 years of continuous flight, moving as fast as anything we've ever launched into deep space has ever sustained, Voyager 1 still hasn't covered the distance of even one single light year. Not the 4+ light years to Proxima Centauri, 1. That's not a mission running behind schedule. That's the actual, demonstrated scale of what far means out here, made concrete by something genuinely built and genuinely flown, not modelled on paper. Now bring in the fastest thing humanity has ever built. Full stop. Regardless of which direction it was pointed. As of December 2024, that title belongs to the Parker Solar Probe, a spacecraft the size of a small car, which reached 192.22 kilometers per second, the fastest speed any human-made object has ever recorded. That's roughly 690,000 kilometers an hour. It's a genuinely staggering achievement. and it's worth sitting with before the next sentence takes it away from you. That speed didn't come from an engine built for sustained travel outward. It came from diving straight toward the sun, borrowing momentum from the sun's own gravity on a plunge past it. Closer to our star than anything we've built has ever gone. It is a speed earned by falling, not by cruising. No spacecraft humanity has ever built has sustained anything close to that velocity on an outbound trip toward open, empty space where there is no star to fall toward and steal speed from. But suspend that objection for one moment purely as an exercise, because the exercise is the point. Imagine, hypothetically, that we could somehow hold on to that record-breaking speed, the fastest anything human-made has ever moved. For the entire distance to Proxima Centauri b, with nothing slowing the ship down along the way, do the arithmetic honestly, and the number that comes back is somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 years. Not 6,000 hours, not 6,000 days. 6,000 years at our single fastest recorded speed, sustained the whole way, which no propulsion system in existence can actually do. That's the reversal the math forces on you. This was never a "how many years does the flight take" problem. The kind of question a mission planner answers with a countdown clock. It's a "how many human lifetimes fit end to end inside that gap" problem. And the honest answer, using our best real numbers, is many. A human lifespan tops out, generously, somewhere around a century. 6,000 years divided by a century isn't a delay. It's a different category of undertaking entirely. And notice that Proxima b is the generous case here. The nearest candidate, the smallest number available to work with. Widen the search even slightly, and the numbers don't get friendlier. The TRAPPIST-1 system, home to 7 Earth-sized worlds, 3 of them, sitting in a zone where liquid water could plausibly survive on a surface, sits roughly 40 light-years out, very close to 10 times farther than Proxima b. 10 times the light-year gap, 10 times the 6,000-year hypothetical. Choosing a more interesting destination doesn't make the trip more manageable. It makes exactly the same problem larger, in direct proportion. It helps to feel the 6,000-year hypothetical from Chapter 1 in something other than a unit of time. Because 6,000 years is easy to say and hard to actually picture. 6,000 years ago, agriculture was only just beginning to spread out from its earliest centers. And writing hadn't been invented anywhere on Earth yet. There was no way, anywhere, for a human being to leave a permanent record for someone who wasn't standing in front of them. That's the depth of time sitting inside a single one-way interstellar crossing, even at our fastest sustained real-world speed. Not a long weekend, not a long life, a span longer than recorded history itself. The idea of answering that kind of gap by building something that survives it, rather than something fast enough to beat it, isn't a new thought experiment invented for this story either. It has a name and a real, decades-deep body of research behind it. Scientists and engineers studying exactly this category of mission call it, formally, a generation ship, or in some of the literature, a world ship. Not a vehicle in the ordinary sense of something you ride, but a self-sufficient, multi-generational habitat designed from the outset to be lived in indefinitely by people who will never see its departure and its destination inside the same single lifetime. It's been taken seriously enough by researchers willing to do the harder population biology and systems engineering arithmetic rather than simply assuming a crew roster and moving on, that dedicated academic projects exist specifically to work out what a population like that would actually need to survive intact across the whole voyage. Its minimum size, its genetic management, its timeline against real propulsion limits. That's the tradition this story's numbers are drawn from throughout what follows. Not speculation dressed up as fact, but people who have already sat with the harder version of this arithmetic, in public, peer-reviewed detail, and published what it actually costs. It's worth heading off. Right here, the the two assumptions that usually try to quietly solve this problem for you before you've finished feeling its size. The first is that this is fundamentally an engine problem. That enough thrust closes the gap the way a stronger engine closes a long highway drive. It doesn't, and the reason isn't a failure of ambition, it's built into the basic physics of rockets. A rocket has to carry its own fuel. Accelerating that fuel costs more fuel, which itself then has to be accelerated in a spiral of diminishing returns that's been understood since the early 20th century. Past a certain point, adding more thrust mostly buys you the ability to carry more fuel, not meaningfully more speed. It's a genuine ceiling, not a budget line waiting for more investment. The same relationship the Russian scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky worked out mathematically over a century ago, and which engineers still simply call the rocket equation because nothing about it has changed since. This is, in fact, exactly why the century-scale proposals worth taking seriously don't try to beat that equation head-on. Rather than carrying more and more onboard fuel to fight the ceiling directly, the more credible published concepts look for ways to sidestep the equation's assumptions entirely. Propulsion that draws reaction mass or energy from outside the ship rather than carrying all of it from launch or acceleration, sustained gently over years so that a smaller amount of thrust, applied patiently, adds up to a genuinely useful cruise speed without ever needing an implausible mountain of onboard fuel. It's a real category of solution, seriously studied, not hand-waved. It still, in every published estimate, tops out well short of a single human lifespan. The second assumption is subtler, and it tends to arrive dressed up as physics rather than as hope that relativity's own strangeness, time running measurably slower for anything moving fast enough, quietly solves the duration problem for the people aboard, even if it doesn't solve it for anyone watching from Earth. Time dilation is real. It's confirmed, measured, not in dispute. It's also only significant at a meaningful fraction of the speed of light, and the fastest recorded human-made speed, that record-setting solar dive from a few paragraphs ago, comes in at roughly 0.002% of light speed. At that fraction, a clock aboard the ship and a clock left behind on Earth would drift apart by an amount too small to meaningfully shorten anyone's felt experience of a multi-year trip, let alone a multi-century one. Relativity is not the quiet escape hatch it sounds like. Not at any speed humanity has actually demonstrated. It would matter enormously if humanity ever built something that could sustain a real, meaningful fraction of light speed for years on end. At 10 or 20% of light speed, the time dilation becomes large enough to genuinely change the math for the people aboard, even while the arithmetic for everyone left behind on Earth stays exactly as brutal as Chapter 1 already laid out. Nothing in this story is claiming that's impossible forever. It's claiming, honestly, that nothing humanity has ever built or seriously tested comes remotely close to that fraction today, which means the escape hatch is real in principle and simply not available yet on any timeline anyone can currently commit to. Now, to be fair to the engineers who actually study this seriously, nobody credible is proposing we chase Proxima b at Parker Solar Probe speeds, sustained by nothing, forever. Serious published proposals for advanced propulsion, some combination of nuclear, staged, or exotic drive concepts that exist today only as papers, models, and small-scale tests, not as flight hardware, argue for shaving that 6,000-year hypothetical down substantially into the range of centuries rather than millennia. What these century-scale concepts share, whatever the specific propulsion approach any one of them favors, is that none of them defeats the rocket equation ceiling by brute force. Instead, they chip away at the problem from other angles. Propulsion that doesn't require carrying all of its own reaction mass, or a slower, steadier acceleration, sustained over years instead of a short, violent burn, or some blend of both. Each real approach buys back meaningful time. None of them, in any serious published estimate, buys back enough, translates centuries into something more human-shaped before moving on, because the unit of time that actually matters here isn't the year, it's the generation. A typical human generation, birthed to the age of having your own children, runs somewhere around 25 to 30 years. Even the more optimistic centuries-scale proposals, taken at their most generous, mean something in the range of a dozen to 20 full human generations being born, raised, growing old, and dying, one after another, entirely inside the hull, before the ship reaches anywhere at all. Not one generation making a long journey, something closer to 15, stacked end to end, each one inheriting the mission from the last and handing it to the next, with the very first among them, the one who actually chose this, at the hatch, gone long before even the second or third generation has finished growing up. That's a real, meaningful improvement over the naive 6,000-year number, and it deserves to be taken seriously as genuine progress rather than dismissed alongside the more extreme hypothetical it improves on. It's also, centuries is not a human lifespan either, whether the honest figure lands closer to 60 centuries or 6. The trip still, categorically, in every serious analysis that respects the actual physics, outlasts the body of anyone who boards it. That's the fact this entire subject rests on, and it deserves to be stated plainly instead of dressed up. There is no known propulsion system, and no seriously proposed one, that turns a realistic interstellar crossing into a single lifetime journey. Not difficult, not expensive, structurally, mathematically incompatible with one human lifespan, using every number we actually have, from the fastest object we've ever built to the most optimistic, serious proposals on paper, which means the question was never going to be, how do we build something fast enough to get you there? It was always going to be, how do we build something that can survive long after you personally can't? A ship, in other words, that has to outlive its own passengers by design, not as a tragic accident of the mission, but as its founding requirement, decided before a single hull plate is ever welded. Everything that follows, every system, every choice, every cost this story is about to walk through, exists because that one piece of arithmetic refuses to move. If you can't outrun the timescale, you have to build something that survives it. And the first thing that something has to survive isn't the vacuum outside the hull. It's the ordinary, unglamorous, everyday demand of keeping a human body alive, hour after hour, for far longer than any one person's life. For far longer than any one person's life. Strip away the 6,000-year headline number and get small. Get down to the scale that actually matters to you personally. Standing inside the hull, what is your body depending on, right now, this minute, to not die? 3 things, mainly. And all 3 sound simple until you look at what simple costs at century scale. The first is air, and specifically air you didn't bring with you. A ship like this can't carry enough breathable atmosphere from Earth to last centuries. It has to make its own, continuously, by recycling what's already aboard, pulling carbon dioxide back out of the air people exhale, splitting water to regenerate oxygen, filtering and reusing water that's already passed through human bodies and plant systems more times than anyone aboard could count. None of this is exotic. Versions of closed-loop recycling already run, in smaller form, on crewed spacecraft today, cycling the same water and air through the same small crew for months at a time. What's exotic here is the duration, and what the duration does to the margin for error. A system engineered to run reliably for a 6-month mission is being asked, on a generation ship, to run without full replacement for hundreds of years, maintained the whole time by people who didn't design it, using parts fabricated from raw material the ship carries or can process, because there is no supply run coming, ever, for anyone aboard. Think through what that actually requires in practice, not just in principle. Every filter has a service life. Every seal degrades. Every pump has bearings that wear. On a 6-month mission, we have a spare. And if we don't, Mission Control has a plan. Covers almost every failure mode anyone can imagine. On a multi-century mission, the ship either has to carry an almost unthinkable depth of spare parts for a machine whose engineers are all dead, or it has to carry the industrial capacity, the raw materials, the manufacturing tools, and the trained people, to fabricate new parts from scratch, indefinitely, forever, using nothing but what's already inside the hull. That second option isn't a stretch goal bolted onto the mission. It's a requirement baked in from day one, because there is no third option. The second dependency is protection from radiation, and this is where simple gets expensive fast. Outside the shielding of Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field, deep space is bathed in galactic cosmic rays, a steady rain of high-energy particles that measurements from interplanetary spacecraft have clocked at roughly 1.84 millisieverts per day in open space, compared to about 0.70 millisieverts per day on the surface of Mars, where the planet itself blocks a meaningful share of the exposure. For context on what that daily trickle adds up to, models of a round-trip crewed Mars mission, a mission lasting somewhere around 1,000 days total, not centuries, already put the cumulative dose in a range associated with meaningfully elevated lifetime cancer risk, with central estimates for radiation-linked mortality and morbidity that some analyses put above roughly 5 and 10% respectively. That's for a mission measured in months to a couple of years, undertaken by adults who volunteered, fully informed, for exactly that level of risk. A generation ship isn't measured in months. Every single person born aboard, not just the ones who volunteered at launch, but every descendant who never got a say in any of it, inherits some version of that same daily exposure across an entire lifetime, unless the ship carries enough shielding mass to meaningfully cut it. And shielding mass is not free. More mass means more fuel needed to accelerate and decelerate that mass, which means either a slower ship, a far larger one, or both. The radiation problem doesn't just threaten health in isolation, it reaches backward through the whole design and makes the propulsion problem worse, which makes the timescale problem worse, which is the same 6,000-year problem from Chapter 1, quietly feeding itself from a different angle. The third dependency is gravity, and here the physics is almost elegant, which makes what it demands almost easy to miss. You can't fake gravity in deep space with anything Earth-based technology actually has. No floor secretly pulls you down. What you can do is spin, rotate a cylindrical hull, and the same physics that presses you against the door of a car taking a fast turn will press you against the inner wall of that spinning hull, and your body will read that force as weight. Serious designs for large rotating habitats. The kind sketched out in aerospace engineering literature going back decades. Built around paired counter-rotating cylinders several kilometers long. Calculate that, at that scale, spinning at only around half a rotation per minute is enough to produce something close to a full Earth gravity at the rim. Half a rotation per minute is slow. From inside, at that scale, gravity would feel steady, ordinary, almost boring, nothing like a carnival ride. The counter-rotation of the paired cylinders even cancels out the gyroscopic wobble that a single giant spinning tube would otherwise develop. So the whole structure holds its orientation instead of tumbling as it moves. It's a real, calculable, physically sound solution. But notice the hidden clause tucked inside. At that scale, the gentle, comfortable version of spin gravity only works if the habitat is enormous. Kilometers across, shrink the radius, and the same math that gives you a comfortable half rotation per minute on a giant cylinder forces a much smaller ship to spin dramatically faster to produce the same felt gravity. Fast enough that your inner ear starts noticing the rotation itself, a nauseating sideways tug called a Coriolis effect, every time you turn your head or walk briskly across the deck instead of standing still. reach for a cup on a shelf too quickly on a small, fast-spinning habitat, and your inner ear reports a lurch that has nothing to do with the cup. The physics of spin gravity isn't really a story about spin. It's a story about radius. And radius is a story about how large, and how expensive, and how slow to build in the first place. The ship has to be before living inside it stops feeling like living inside a machine that's actively fighting you. So there are your three unglamorous, load-bearing dependencies. Air that has to regenerate itself for centuries without failing, shielding that has to fight a steady drizzle of radiation without making the ship too heavy to move, and gravity that only feels natural if the ship is genuinely, expensively enormous. None of these is a single dramatic point of failure, the kind of thing a warning klaxon catches in time with room to spare. They're the opposite. Slow, compounding drifts, a filter running very slightly less efficiently than spec, a shielding calculation based on assumptions nobody alive can re-verify. A rotational bearing wearing down a fraction of a percent per decade. Each one invisible day to day, each one only becoming undeniable once it's had years, or a generation, to compound quietly in the background. And here is the detail that should actually sit with you longer than the numbers do. None of these systems were designed, tested, or approved by the people who will eventually be trusting their lives to them. They were designed by people who are, by the time any real strain shows up, already dead. Every system keeping you alive right now is a system your grandchildren are going to inherit, essentially unaudited, built by hands they never met. For a version of normal operation nobody left aboard has ever personally witnessed working any other way, sustained only by whatever training and documentation the generations in between bothered to keep alive. That's not a flaw in the plan. It's the plan working exactly as intended. And it's the first moment the mission stops being purely an engineering problem and starts being something closer to an inheritance. One that has to be actively re-earned, relearned, and retrusted by people who had no part in writing it. Keeping any of these three systems running for centuries isn't only a materials problem either. It's a knowledge problem, quietly, every single day. The person who actually understood why a given filter was rated for a given service life, or why a shielding calculation assumed the numbers it did, is not going to be aboard by the time that knowledge is next actually needed. Which means the ship has to run something closer to a permanent, unbroken apprenticeship. Every generation training the next one not just to operate the systems, but to genuinely understand them well enough to diagnose a problem nobody currently aboard has ever personally seen happen, using documentation written by people none of them ever met, in language and assumptions that may have quietly drifted from what any given generation finds intuitive. Lose that chain even once, in a moment of complacency or crisis or simple bad luck, and the ship doesn't just lose information. It loses the ability to know it's lost anything at all, until a system that was supposed to be understood turns out, when it finally matters, not to be. Picture the shape that kind of drift actually takes 3 or 4 generations in, because slow compounding failure is easy to say and hard to actually feel. A routine air quality sensor reading comes back a fraction of a percent outside its historical range. Not an alarm, not even really a flag, just a number very slightly different from the one logged the week before and the week before that. Nobody aboard was alive when the sensor was calibrated. Nobody fully remembers why the tolerance band was set where it was. Only that the manual says so. Someone has to decide, with only the ship's own accumulated records to go on and no outside expert to call, whether that fraction of a percent is the beginning of something or simply noise, and has to make that call correctly, using judgment inherited from training that was itself inherited. Because getting it wrong in either direction has consequences that won't fully show up for years. That's not a dramatic scene, and it isn't supposed to be one. It's the actual texture of what trusting a system unaudited feels like from the inside. Repeated in some form, on some system, more or less constantly, for as long as the ship keeps moving. Every layer of redundancy built in against that kind of drift comes with its own cost too. And there's no version of the design that escapes the trade. Carry too little spare capacity, too few backup systems, too thin a margin, and a single bad decade can cascade into something nobody aboard can recover from. Carry too much. And the ship gets heavier, which, per the propulsion math from Chapter 1, makes it slower, which makes the whole trip longer, which means more decades for something to eventually drift in the first place. There is no setting on that dial that simply removes the risk. There's only a choice about which shape of risk a given generation of designers, none of whom will be aboard to see how it plays out, decides to accept on behalf of everyone who comes after them. Aerospace engineering has a name for the design principle at stake here, and it's worth borrowing because it clarifies exactly what's being traded away. Avoid a single point of failure, meaning no one component should be able to bring down the whole system if it breaks. On a 6-month mission, achieving that mostly means carrying a spare or two of anything critical. On a centuries-long mission, it means something closer to carrying an entire duplicate civilization's worth of manufacturing capability, because eventually every spare runs out and the only remaining backup is the ability to make a new one from scratch. Water reclamation is a clean example of what that actually looks like in practice. Not one recycling loop, but several independent ones, deliberately overlapping so that a fault discovered in one doesn't leave anyone aboard without drinkable water while it's diagnosed and repaired. Each redundant loop adding its own mass, its own maintenance burden, its own apprenticeship chain of people who understand how it works, stacked on top of every other system already carrying the same requirement. Shielding follows the identical logic at an even higher price. The straightforward way to cut the 1.84 millisievert per day dose rate from earlier in this chapter is simply mass. Thick layers of water, polyethylene, or metal wrapped around the places people actually live and sleep, since dense material absorbs the incoming particles before they ever reach a human body. The more shielding, the lower the daily dose, in a relationship that's genuinely straightforward. What isn't straightforward is that every extra ton of shielding is also a ton. The propulsion system now has to accelerate up to cruise speed and then decelerate again at the far end, which pulls directly against the centuries instead of millennia gain the last chapter fought so hard to establish. A ship over-engineered for radiation safety can end up under-engineered for speed, and a ship optimized purely for speed can end up exposing everyone aboard to a lifetime of accumulated dose no medical team would ever approve for a shorter mission. There's no version of the design that maximizes both at once. Every real proposal for a mission like this is, at its core, a negotiation between how fast you're willing to go and how much radiation you're willing to let every future generation inherit for the privilege. And none of these three dependencies actually runs in isolation from the other two. However cleanly this chapter has separated them for the sake of walking through each in turn. Add shielding mass to solve the radiation problem, and the ship grows heavier, which changes how much thrust is needed to reach and hold cruise speed, which changes the total mission duration, which changes how many years. Or generations. Every recycling loop and every rotating bearing actually needs to run without failure. Build the habitat larger to get comfortable. Low Coriolis spin gravity, and there's more air to recycle, more water to reclaim, more surface area exposed to radiation that now needs shielding across a bigger structure. Every gain in one system quietly taxes the other two. There's no version of this ship where an engineer can solve air, then solve radiation, then solve gravity. It's one integrated design problem with three faces. And every number in it moves the other two, whether anyone intends it to or not. Given everything the last chapter just laid out, it would be reasonable to expect this chapter to be bleak. It isn't. Not entirely, because real engineering has actually tackled pieces of this, with results worth taking seriously before the next complication arrives. Start with food and air, because the two are more tangled together than they first appear. The proposal grow it, recycle it, keep the whole thing running as a closed loop rather than a one-way store of stockpiled supplies, has already been tested at genuinely large, real-world scale, not just in a lab, not just in simulation. Between 1991 and 1993, 8 people sealed themselves inside Biosphere 2, a 3-acre glass and steel structure in the Arizona desert, built to be a fully self-contained miniature world. Its own rainforest, its own ocean, its own farmland, its own recycled air and water. No imports, no exports, for 2 full years. It is, to date, one of the most ambitious closed ecosystem experiments ever attempted, with actual human beings living inside it full time. And for a while, remarkably, it worked. People lived, ate food they grew themselves, breathed air their own miniature biosphere produced. It stood as real, physical proof that the basic concept, a sealed system that keeps humans alive on what it generates internally, isn't science fiction. It's been built at real scale, and people have actually lived inside it. Even the parts of that mission that struggled are instructive rather than damning. The crew inside Biosphere 2 also found themselves unable to grow quite enough food to comfortably sustain 8 adults on the yields their internal farmland actually produced, a real, measured shortfall rather than a hypothetical risk, which meant real caloric restriction became part of daily life inside the dome well before the oxygen crisis ever became the headline problem. That's useful information, not just a cautionary footnote. It tells engineers designing the next closed system exactly where the yield margins actually need padding, instead of leaving that padding to guesswork. It isn't only a 2-year experiment from the early 1990s. Either, ongoing research programs are still actively working the same problem today. The European Space Agency's MELISA project, the name stands for Microecological Life Support System Alternative, has spent more than 2 decades developing a closed-loop life support system aimed at close to full self-sufficiency. Recycling carbon dioxide, wastewater, and organic waste back into breathable air, drinkable water, and edible food, using a deliberately compartmentalized chain of microbial bioreactors and plant growth chambers rather than one single miracle process trying to do everything at once. A dedicated pilot plant built to test the approach at real physical scale, not just in simulation, opened after that same 2 decades of accumulated research. None of this proves the problem is fully solved. It proves the problem is being worked seriously, continuously, by people whose entire job is closing exactly the kind of gap Biosphere 2 first exposed, which is a meaningfully more hopeful place to stand than pure speculation, even if it isn't yet a finished answer. There's a harder problem sitting underneath even the most promising version of this research, though, one that no amount of additional lab time fully resolves. How do you actually validate a system that's meant to run for 300 years, when the longest anyone can realistically test it before launch is a handful of years, in a lab, on Earth, under conditions that are themselves only an approximation of what the finished ship will actually experience? Every closed-loop life support system humanity has ever built and tested, Biosphere 2 included, MELISA's pilot plant included, has been validated over a span of years, not centuries, because no research program has the luxury of waiting 300 years to find out if its own design works before deciding whether to build the real thing, which means the version of the system that actually launches will always, necessarily, be extrapolated a long way past anything it's been directly proven to do. An educated, careful, rigorously modeled extrapolation, but an extrapolation nonetheless. resting on the assumption that a few years of clean laboratory performance predicts a few centuries of real performance, drifting slowly under load, maintained by people who weren't there for any of the original testing. One design response researchers point to, drawn directly from the redundancy logic in Chapter 2, is to avoid building one single Biosphere 2-scale ecosystem at all, and instead run several smaller, deliberately independent closed biomes in parallel, so that the specific, unanticipated soil chemistry that quietly drained Biosphere 2's oxygen in one enclosed system doesn't have the entire ship's food and air supply riding on it at once. It's the same principle as the water loop redundancy from the last chapter, applied to biology instead of plumbing. Several smaller, imperfect, independently monitored systems, each capable of covering for a neighbor that starts to drift. Instead of one large system that either works perfectly or endangers everyone the moment it doesn't. It doesn't remove the underlying uncertainty. It just makes sure that uncertainty, when it eventually surfaces in one contained compartment instead of in the only air anyone aboard has to breathe. The gravity problem, similarly, isn't a hand wave dressed up in technical language. The rotating cylinder concept from the last chapter isn't a screenwriter's invention. It comes out of decades of serious aerospace engineering literature, complete with the rotation rate math, the counter-rotation solution to gyroscopic drift, the radius versus comfort trade-offs worked out in enough detail to be genuinely buildable, not merely imaginable. None of it has been constructed at full scale, but none of it depends on undiscovered physics either. It's an engineering and construction problem, a question of budget, materials, and time, not a "we don't actually know if this is possible" problem, which, next to everything else in this story, counts as good news worth pausing on. The honest caveat sits in the maintenance timeline rather than the underlying physics. And it's the same caveat Chapter 2 already raised about filters and seals, now applied to something far larger: bearings, joints, and structural material under continuous rotational stress for centuries, not years. Every rotating machine humanity has ever built, turbines, engines, the reaction wheels aboard existing spacecraft, has a service life, after which its bearings wear, its structure fatigues, and it needs to be rebuilt or replaced. A habitat spinning continuously for centuries is, mechanically, the same kind of machine as any of those. The amazing ATA, just enormously larger and utterly without the option of docking somewhere for scheduled maintenance from an outside provider. The physics of getting comfortable spin gravity are solved. The physics of keeping a kilometers-long structure spinning smoothly for 300 consecutive years, repaired the entire time by people trained by the original engineers, is a different, much less finished kind of solved. None of this comes cheap, either, and it's worth naming the economics honestly, instead of treating engineering feasibility as the only obstacle standing between here and a launch, a structure built to comfortably house a population in the thousands, shielded against decades of accumulated radiation, redundant enough in its life support to survive centuries of unaudited use, spun up to a stable, comfortable gravity at a radius measured in kilometers, isn't a National Space Agency budget line. It's closer to the largest and longest single construction project a civilization has ever committed to. Undertaken with the near certainty that nobody who authorizes it, funds it, or builds the first section of hull will live to see it launch, let alone arrive. Serious proposals in this space treat that as a genuine constraint on when such a mission becomes plausible at all. Not simply a matter of solving the physics, but of a civilization becoming wealthy, stable, and patient enough, across generations of its own, to actually commit the resources before a single person aboard the eventual ship is even born. One serious response to that uncertainty, raised in the literature on mission planning for undertakings this large, is to test the hardest pieces of the concept on a smaller, shorter, precursor mission first. A crude or robotic pathfinder lasting years or a few decades rather than centuries, built specifically to validate the closed-loop life support, the rotating habitat structure, and the population management approach at a scale and duration that can actually be observed and corrected within the lifetime of the people who designed it. It doesn't remove the fundamental extrapolation problem raised earlier in this chapter. A few decades of precursor data still isn't a few centuries of real performance, but it narrows the gap between what's been tested and what's being trusted, which, given everything the rest of this story has walked through, is very likely the only kind of progress actually available before a real generation ship could responsibly launch at all. There's a psychological version of the same reassurance versus reality gap worth naming here too, because it's easy to let "it's been tested" quietly do more comforting work than it's actually earned. Biosphere 2 was tested. Melissa is being tested. The rotating habitat math has been checked and rechecked on paper for decades. Every one of those facts is true. And every one of them is also, honestly, a test of a system running for a handful of years at most by people who knew exactly how long the test would last and exactly when help could arrive if something went badly wrong. None of that transfers cleanly to a population who will never know from the inside whether the system they've inherited is performing within the range anyone actually validated, or has quietly drifted past it decades ago in a way nobody currently aboard has the outside comparison to notice. It's been done before is true. It's been done before, at this duration, at this stake, with no way to check the answer isn't. And the gap between those two sentences is exactly the gap this mission is asking thousands of people to live inside. And the crewing model itself, building the mission around a population that lives, works, reproduces, and dies aboard across generations, rather than trying to somehow preserve a single crew intact across the whole voyage, isn't the fanciful option here. It's closer to the only currently plausible one, the alternative that shows up constantly in speculation, some form of long-duration suspended animation that lets a single crew sleep through centuries and wake up unaged at the far end, remains exactly that, speculation. Nothing resembling multi-century human hibernation has ever been demonstrated, even at a small scale, even in principle, in any peer-reviewed or engineering literature worth citing here. A second alternative, sending the ship unmanned, a robotic seed mission carrying frozen embryos or genetic material instead of living people, to be raised by machines only after arrival, sidesteps several of these problems neatly. But it also quietly changes the subject entirely. It's no longer a story about what a person experiences during the journey, because no person experiences any of it, whatever its engineering merits. It answers a different question than the one this is actually about. Generational crewing is unglamorous, specifically because it's the option that doesn't require inventing a new technology, and the option that keeps an actual human experience inside the story instead of removing it. It only requires managing the biology and the society we already have for a very, very long time, with no shortcuts available. So take the moment of hope seriously. Air and food, solved in concept and partially proven at real scale. Gravity, solved on paper by known, buildable physics. A crewing model chosen not out of romance, but because it's the one option that doesn't require a technology nobody has ever built, and the only one that keeps a person, rather than an embryo bank, at the center of the mission. Then look again at what actually happened inside Biosphere 2, because the hopeful version of that story is only half of it, and the other half is the one that matters more for everything still ahead. Over the first 16 months of that 2-year closure, the oxygen level inside the sealed structure didn't stay steady. It fell from a normal 21% down to around 14%, a level low enough to cause real physiological problems. Fatigue, difficulty thinking clearly, trouble sleeping, in the actual living people breathing that air every day. The cause wasn't a mechanical breakdown anyone could point to and fix with a wrench. It was biological and completely unanticipated going in. And microbes in that soil were consuming oxygen and producing carbon dioxide at a rate nobody had modeled beforehand, faster than the enclosed ecosystem's plants could replace it, with some of that carbon dioxide even reacting chemically with the structure's own concrete instead of staying in the loop where the plants could ever get access to it again. By 1993, engineers had to pump outside oxygen in from beyond the sealed boundary, just to keep the people inside functioning safely enough to continue the mission. Sit with what that actually means, because it's easy to read past a historical anecdote too quickly. As a demonstration of a fully self-sustaining closed system, Biosphere 2's first mission failed, on its own stated terms, with a rescue option sitting right outside the wall the entire time, and with a team of outside scientists actively monitoring the failure as it unfolded in real time. On a real ship crossing interstellar distance, there is no outside oxygen tank to pump in. There is no wall with open desert on the far side of it, and no outside team watching the numbers drift and stepping in before they become dangerous. Whatever imbalance emerges in the atmosphere, in the soil, in a nutrient cycle nobody fully understood until it had already drifted for years, has to be caught and corrected by whoever happens to be aboard when it happens, using only what the ship already carries, with no possibility of resupply and, depending on how far out the ship already is, no possibility of turning back either. That's the honest shape of the fix. The hardware genuinely can be engineered into something that mostly works. The biology, the physics, the crewing logic, all check out on paper and in partial real-world tests, sometimes at real scale. What none of those tests solved, what none of that engineering was ever designed to solve, is the part of the system made of people, thousands of them, born into a sealed loop they didn't choose, expected to catch every slow drift the original engineers never lived to see, using knowledge that has to survive being taught, generation after generation, by people who themselves only ever learned it secondhand. Solve the air. Solve the gravity. You still haven't solved the part of the problem that's made of people. And that part is where the real cost of this mission actually gets paid. In full. Here's where the story stops being about machines and starts being about numbers of human beings, which is a much harder thing to be honest about. Begin with genetics, because it's the least intuitive piece and the most unforgiving. It's tempting to picture a generation ship carrying a small, elite crew, a few dozen highly trained specialists, maybe a couple hundred at most, the kind of tight roster you'd see assembled for any high-stakes mission, chosen for skill and discipline rather than size. Published population genetics research specifically modeling multi-generational interstellar voyages says that instinct is wrong, and wrong by roughly an order of magnitude. Peer-reviewed analysis of what it actually takes to keep a population genetically healthy across a voyage lasting generations, avoiding inbreeding depression, surviving the founder effect of starting from a small gene pool, absorbing at least one severe population shock somewhere along the way, whether disease, accident, or something the original planners never anticipated. A possibility the research treats not as an edge case to be designed around, but as close to a statistical certainty over a voyage that long, the same way any population of thousands, isolated for centuries, should expect at least one bad decade somewhere in its history. Concludes that viability across several generations is rarely modeled as possible with anything below a population in the low thousands. Not dozens, not a couple hundred. Thousands of people, at minimum, living, working, and reproducing aboard, essentially none of whom, beyond the very first generation at the hatch, will have volunteered for any of it. That number alone reframes everything this story has covered so far. This was never a crew, in the sense the word usually implies. It was always going to be a small city. sealed inside a hull, expected to sustain itself biologically for as long as the trip takes, which, per Chapter 1, is longer than any single person involved will live to see resolved. A peer-reviewed academic effort focused specifically on estimating what a genetically viable population for a multi-generational interstellar voyage would actually require, built by reviewing the existing population genetics literature rather than guessing at a comfortable round number. The mechanisms it's protecting against are worth naming plainly, because the jargon tends to hide how intuitive they actually are once unpacked. The founder effect is simply what happens when a new population starts from too small and too specific a sample of a larger one. Whatever genetic variation wasn't present in the founders is gone for good, for everyone who comes after, with no way to get it back short of contact with an outside population that, aboard a ship, will never come. Genetic drift is what happens next, generation after generation, as random chance. Who happens to have children, and how many? Narrows the remaining variation still further, purely by accident, with no selection pressure required to do the narrowing. Inbreeding depression is the eventual, measurable cost of both. Reduced fertility, increased vulnerability to disease, a population quietly less resilient than the one that left the launch pad. For genetic reasons, no amount of good governance can retroactively repair once they've taken hold. Guarding against all three simultaneously, across the full length of a voyage that might last centuries, is precisely why the number has to sit in the thousands rather than the dozens. And precisely why some form of deliberate reproductive planning, tracking lineages and managing pairings across a population that size, stops being a dystopian flourish, added for dramatic effect, and becomes, in the actual published research, a structural requirement of the mission surviving at all. That requirement lands on real people, not on an abstract population curve. And it's worth naming the tension honestly, rather than letting the word planning soften it. Somewhere aboard, some structure, a council, a rotating body of elected representatives, whatever the ship's governance eventually settles into, has to hold real information about who is related to whom, closely enough to matter genetically, across a population that will functionally resemble a small town where most people already know each other. That structure then has to find some way to make that information matter to people's actual, private, deeply personal choices about who they build a life with, and whether to have children at all, without simply overriding those choices by force. Because a population that feels itself being bred rather than living its own life is exactly the population Chapter 6's mutiny risk describes. The honest version of this isn't a rulebook handed down from the first generation and followed unquestioningly forever. It's closer to an ongoing, uncomfortable negotiation between collective survival and individual autonomy, renewed by every generation in turn, with no version of the negotiation that fully satisfies both sides at once, and no version of the mission that survives without someone, somewhere, willing to keep having that argument. Now layer the radiation math from Chapter 2 back on top of that population and stretch it across a full lifetime instead of a single mission. Cumulative dose estimates for a Mars round trip, measured in a small number of years, with a return to Earth's protection waiting at the end, already sit in a range associated with meaningfully elevated cancer and degenerative disease risk, on the order of a 5 to 10% increase in serious outcomes by some published central estimates, for a mission of roughly 1,000 days. A generation ship offers no return to Earth's protection, ever, for anyone born aboard. Every single person in that population of thousands is either accepting some version of that elevated risk as a lifelong condition of simply being born at all, inherited the way a family trait is inherited, or the ship is carrying vastly more shielding mass than any Mars mission ever needed. Mass that, as established in Chapter 2, makes the ship heavier, slower, and harder to build in the first place. in exactly the speed versus dose trade-off that has no clean answer. There is no version of this where the bill simply doesn't come due. It's paid either in shielding mass, which worsens the timescale problem, or in the bodies of people who never asked to be exposed to it, generation after generation, for as long as the mission continues. Tracking what that exposure actually does to people across a population that size and a time span that long is its own quiet burden layered on top of the medical staff. The ship has to keep trained generation after generation. Through the same apprenticeship problem, Chapter 2 already raised for engineers. A 6-month ISS mission produces a clean, bounded medical record. Exposure in, symptoms and scans out, compared against a small, well-understood set of prior missions. A centuries-long voyage produces something closer to an ongoing multi-generational epidemiological study nobody ever chose to enroll in, where every birth defect, every unusual cancer, every subtle shift in fertility rates has to be logged, compared against records from ancestors none of the current medical staff ever met, and weighed against the ship's own drifting baseline for what typical even means after a few centuries of accumulated exposure. There's no outside population to compare against either, no unexposed control group back on Earth to check the numbers against, because by definition nobody back on Earth is living this specific experiment. Whatever pattern eventually emerges, the ship's own medical archive is the only place it will ever show up. Read, generations later, by people trying to work out whether what they're seeing in their own children is new or just finally visible. Ethicists who've examined generation ship proposals directly tend to land on the same uncomfortable core question underneath all of that population math. Whether it's defensible at all to have children in a way that guarantees, before they're even born, that they'll inherit a specific, lifelong radiation exposure and a mission they had no opportunity to consent to. There isn't a settled answer in that literature, and this isn't the place to invent one on its behalf. What is worth naming plainly is that the question doesn't go away just because the mission succeeds on every engineering and biological metric this story has covered. A ship that keeps its population genetically viable, its radiation exposure managed, and its society intact for centuries can still, by that same ethical reckoning, be asking something of every person born after the first generation that none of them ever agreed to. A cost this story hasn't been counting in millisieverts or population totals, but that belongs on the same ledger as both. There's a narrower, more immediate version of that same tension that shows up long before anyone reaches for the ethics literature. What happens to any single person aboard whose body simply doesn't hold up to any of this, through no failing of their own? A population in the thousands, over generations, will produce people with chronic illness, disability, and conditions the ship's medical training never quite anticipated, the same way any population that size does anywhere. Except here, there's no specialist a shuttle can fly in, no hospital in another city to refer a hard case to, no wider medical system to fall back on when the ship's own accumulated knowledge runs out. Whatever standard of care a given generation can actually provide is bounded entirely by what medical knowledge and equipment the ship happens to be carrying and has managed to keep functional, inherited like everything else through the same apprenticeship chain, with no way to import an answer the ship itself doesn't already have. That's what a severe population shock actually looks like from the inside. When it eventually arrives, as the research assumes it eventually will, not a single dramatic catastrophe with a clear before and after, but an epidemic moving through a sealed population with nowhere to quarantine to, or an accident in a critical system that kills or incapacitates a disproportionate share of one generation's trained specialists at once, or a run of bad reproductive outcomes that the ship's own medical archive only recognizes as a pattern after it's already shrunk the available gene pool further than the Hyperion research assumed it safely could. Whichever shape it takes, the population doesn't get to pause the mission to recover from it. The air still needs recycling. The shielding still needs inspecting. someone still has to be trained to do both. Out of whatever smaller, more strained population the shock leaves behind. The same three-part dependency from Chapter 2, running exactly as designed, on exactly the thinner margin the shock just created. And then there's the cost that doesn't show up in any materials list at all. Keeping thousands of people sealed together with no exit from psychologically and socially coming apart before the mission is anywhere near finished. The closest real-world analog humanity actually has. Not hypothetical, documented, studied for decades, comes from Antarctic research stations where crews are isolated in extreme, dark, monotonous conditions for 7 to 8 months at a stretch. That isolation produces a recognized, named condition: winter over syndrome, depression, insomnia, irritability shading into open hostility between people who otherwise have no choice but to keep working alongside each other, measurable declines in concentration and memory, a documented dissociative state researchers call the Antarctic stare, a blank, drifting, fugue-like disengagement that tends to show up especially around the midpoint of the stay, when the isolation has stopped being novel and hasn't yet started to end. Mood, sleep, and adaptation problems alone account for roughly 60% of all the psychological diagnoses recorded in these isolated postings. And the timing of the worst dip is its own kind of data point. Resilience tends to fall hardest, not at the start, and not near the end, but around the point where people realize, consciously, and it visibly changes them. Antarctic winter over crews get one thing a generation ship population never will: an end date they can see coming, and a guaranteed way home once the season turns, however far off that day still feels in the depths of the dark months. A ship crossing centuries of interstellar distance offers neither. There's no known season change waiting on a calendar, no ship arriving from outside to break the isolation, and this is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you, more than any of the numbers around it. The halfway point that historically breaks people's resilience on Earth isn't a season into a mission that lasts less than a year. Scaled up to the length of a real interstellar voyage, it's potentially a full human lifetime into a mission that lasts for many. Someone could live their entire life, from birth to old age, entirely within what would statistically be only the isolation fatigue phase of the voyage, having never personally known anything but that phase, and then hand that exact same unresolved psychological weather down to their children as simply the ordinary emotional climate of being alive. This is the layer where the mission stops being solvable by better hardware, no matter how good the hardware gets. You cannot re-engineer your way out of a population needing to number in the thousands. You cannot re-engineer your way out of radiation accumulating across a lifetime instead of a mission. You cannot re-engineer your way out of isolation, producing the same measurable psychological toll it produces every single time humans have actually tried something like it on Earth, just because the ship is bigger and the trip is longer than anything attempted before. The hidden cost was never a mechanical failure waiting quietly to happen somewhere in the hull. It's the sustained, active, generational work. Reproductive planning across a population large enough to stay genetically viable without anyone being forced into it against their will. Health monitoring across a lifetime of unavoidable exposure, some form of deliberate psychological and social management strong enough to outlast a stress response that, on Earth, has never once had to be sustained for more than about 8 months at a stretch, required just to keep several thousand sealed-in people from fracturing before the ship arrives anywhere at all. None of that is a systems problem anymore, the kind an engineer signs off on and moves past to the next task. It's a life. Yours, if you're the one standing at the hatch, someone else's, indistinguishable in kind if not in detail, for every single generation that follows you. Lived entirely inside the solution you were told, back at the beginning, was the fix. pull all the way back in from the numbers now, down to a single ordinary day, because that's the scale you'd actually be living at, hour by hour, and it's worth walking through honestly instead of skipping straight to the philosophy. You wake to light that was chosen for you, not light that happened to you. There's no sun to argue with, no weather to complain about. So the ship's systems run an engineered day-night cycle, light that dims and warms on a schedule designed to keep your body's internal clock roughly where human circadian rhythms need it to sit, because a body denied any daily light cue at all doesn't handle that absence gracefully. And the ship's designers know it well enough to have planned around it from the start. Gravity, at the rim where you live, comes from the same slow half-rotation per minute spin worked out back in Chapter 2. Steady, ordinary feeling, almost boring, exactly as the physics promised it would be. But walk far enough inward toward the ship's rotational axis, and that same physics starts working against the comfortable version of itself. Gravity thins the closer you get to the center, until near the axis you'd be functionally weightless, drifting rather than walking. A single ship, built on a single piece of consistent physics, ends up divided into genuinely different physical zones, heavy-feeling neighborhoods near the rim, where families sleep and eat, floating work and recreation spaces near the core, not by architectural whim, but because the same rotation that gives you weight at all simply doesn't apply it evenly across the structure. Meals happen on a schedule shaped by the ship's own agricultural cycles, rather than by any tradition carried over from Earth. Whatever the closed-loop farms are actually yielding that season becomes, in a very real sense, what normal food is for an entire childhood, for an entire life, built from whatever crops and cultures the closed-loop biology from Chapter 3 can actually sustain in balance, rather than from whatever anyone might crave. A dish that took hours of imported ingredients on Earth simply doesn't exist here, if the ship's biology can't produce those ingredients in a way the system can absorb back into its own loop. A food culture forms instead around what the ecosystem can actually keep in equilibrium. Generation after generation, the same restrictions from Chapter 3's oxygen and soil balance, quietly shaping what ends up on a plate. Work happens in shifts, assigned by what the ship's systems actually need, not by any career someone dreamed about before they were born. Someone has to monitor the air scrubbers, someone has to inspect the shielding, someone has to teach the next set of children how to do both, because the apprenticeship chain from Chapter 2 doesn't maintain itself. Even clothing ends up shaped by the same closed loop as everything else. Fabric grown, woven, worn, and eventually broken back down and recycled into raw fiber again, rather than replaced from some outside supply. Which means style itself becomes a function of whatever the ship's textile systems can actually sustain in a repeating cycle, generation after generation, rather than of trend or import the way it does on Earth. Recreation, when it happens inside spaces the ship's designers built specifically to give people something other than corridors and consoles to look at. Simulated views, curated recordings, gardens grown as much for the eye as for the harvest. A designed substitute for windows that doesn't perfectly replace an actual sky, however carefully it's built. Children born aboard complicate the schedule in their own way, because they need something no adult volunteer ever required. An education that makes sense of a world with no genuine outside reference for most of what they're being taught. They learn the ship's own systems first and thoroughly, because their survival will eventually depend on maintaining them, the same apprenticeship chain from Chapter 2 running underneath the classroom the way it runs underneath everything else aboard. They learn about Earth the way children elsewhere learn about a distant historical period. Real, documented, but not something any of their senses can verify. Delivered through recordings and archives rather than lived memory, filtered through however many generations of retelling, separate them from anyone who actually once stood under an open sky. Coming of age here isn't marked by anything resembling a driver's license or a trip somewhere new, because there's nowhere new inside the hull to go. It's more likely marked by a first full duty shift on a critical system. The moment the ship's survival starts depending on you personally, rather than only on the adults around you. A rite of passage built entirely out of responsibility rather than freedom, because freedom in the sense of choosing an unfamiliar path was never really on offer here to begin with. Relationships form inside a population that, per Chapter 4, has to stay large enough. Thousands of people. To avoid the genetic and social problems, a smaller, more romantic version of this story would run straight into. That number matters here in a very ordinary, daily way. It's roughly the population of a small town, which means you'd likely know, by sight, if not by name, a meaningful fraction of everyone you will ever share this hull with, for your entire life, with no larger city, no neighboring town, no possibility of ever meeting someone from genuinely outside that fixed set of people. Friendships, rivalries, marriages, grudges, all of it plays out inside the same closed population, generation after generation, with the same family names recurring on work rosters their ancestors once filled, in a community that can't simply grow past its own history the way an open society can, by continually absorbing strangers with different stories. By evening, by whatever evening means under engineered light rather than an actual setting sun, the rhythms of the day fold back toward rest. The corridors dim on schedule. The rim gravity holds steady the way it always has. The ship keeps moving at whatever fraction of light speed the propulsion systems from Chapter 1 were ultimately able to achieve, carrying a population that, for the person actually living inside any given day of it, mostly just feels like an ordinary life. That, more than any of the numbers, might be the strangest part to sit with. From the inside, lived one day at a time, a mission built entirely around impossible arithmetic and irreducible risk would very often simply feel like Tuesday. Your body doesn't get to just enjoy the parts of that arrangement that feel comfortable. Bone and muscle evolved under one specific, constant condition: Earth's gravity, pressing on a skeleton every waking and sleeping minute of every single day of an evolutionary history measured in millions of years. And even the engineered gravity at the rim isn't guaranteed to load your body exactly the way Earth does across an entire lifetime, particularly for anyone who spends real time working or resting nearer the low-gravity core. The clearest real data we have on what happens when the human body's normal load changes comes from astronauts on 6-month missions aboard the International Space Station in genuine microgravity. Bone density loss on the order of 1 to 2% per month in weight-bearing regions, muscle mass losses running 10 to 20% even on short missions and capable of climbing toward 50% on long ones without serious daily intervention. Those numbers exist specifically because ISS crews counter them. Roughly 2.5 hours of mandated exercise, 6 days a week, for the entire mission, just to hold the line against a body that would otherwise quietly dismantle itself. Now stop imagining that discipline as something astronauts do for 6 months, on a fixed schedule, with a return to Earth's gravity waiting at the end to help finish the repair. Start imagining it as something every single person aboard a generation ship has to do, correctly, for their entire life. Not because a mission plan says so, but because their actual skeleton depends on it, forever, with no Earth gravity waiting on the other end of the trip to passively fix whatever drifted along the way. It stops being an astronaut's training regimen, a role someone signed up for. It becomes a basic condition of having a body at all aboard this ship, inherited the same unavoidable way eye color is. And underneath the physical routine sits the psychological one, which is harder to schedule around and easier to underestimate. There's no true horizon here. Every sight line eventually ends at a wall, a curve, a deck overhead that is, however cleverly designed with light and color to soften the effect, still a ceiling. No weather arrives to change the mood of a day on its own, the way a storm front or a clear morning can shift an entire city's temperament without anyone deciding it should. No outsider ever walks in with news from somewhere else. the way even the most isolated Antarctic station can occasionally expect a supply flight or a radio call from beyond the ice. The specific stressors researchers point to in real isolation studies: lack of social variation, the monotony of a physical environment that doesn't meaningfully change, confinement, limited privacy from the same small set of people day after day. Aren't occasional features of shipboard life, things that show up during a hard stretch and then ease off. They're the permanent baseline of it. For everyone, indefinitely, for as long as the ship is moving. For the first generation, the one that boarded at the hatch, all of this is at least a known trade, a conscious exchange, weighed against a purpose they chose with open eyes and a full understanding of what they were giving up. It's the generations after that where the arithmetic gets strange, in a way that's easy to miss if you only ever picture the person who volunteered. Someone born aboard, raised entirely inside engineered light and rim gravity and a horizon that's always a wall, doesn't experience any of this as a sacrifice because they have nothing outside it to compare it to. Their bodies adapt to what the ship actually offers, not to what Earth used to offer and no longer does for them. And adaptation here isn't purely a comfort, it's also, quietly, a kind of loss. The erasure of any lived reference point for what a body or a mind would otherwise have been. Given an open sky and a horizon that isn't a wall, one person adapting to a sealed environment over the course of a life is a private, survivable story. The kind any one individual can carry. 100 generations adapting, one after another, each one starting a little further from any living memory of what wasn't engineered, isn't a private story anymore. It's a civilization quietly forming. In isolation, on its own terms, whether anyone back at the launch ever planned for that or not, a civilization forming inside a sealed hull doesn't get to organize itself the way one does on an open planet, with room to disagree, drift apart, or simply walk away from people you don't get along with and start again somewhere else. There is no away. Here, every disagreement, every fracture, every faction has to be resolved by people who are going to keep sharing the same recycled air with each other for the rest of their lives, whether they ever actually resolve it or not. And the historical record on what happens when sealed groups don't resolve it isn't gentle. Go back to Biosphere 2 one more time, because the story there isn't only about oxygen chemistry, and it never really was. As conditions inside, that closed structure deteriorated, falling oxygen, failing crops, collapsing internal ecosystems the crew had watched be healthy just months before. The 8 people living inside it didn't just face a resource problem to be solved with better rationing. They split into openly hostile factions, disagreeing bitterly enough about how to respond that the human dynamics inside the dome became as much a threat to the mission as the failing biology outside their control was. That happened in 2 years, with 8 adults, all of whom had volunteered with full knowledge of the risks, all of whom knew rescue was physically possible on the other side of a wall if things truly fell apart. A generation ship asks the same basic experiment. Sealed humans, dependent on a closed system, no ability to simply leave, to hold not for 2 years but for centuries, not with 8 consenting adults but with a population in the low thousands, most of whom, as established in Chapter 4, never consented to any of it at all. Biosphere 2 isn't the only real precedent worth holding up here, either. It's just the shortest one. For a longer, genuinely generational example of what small, isolated human populations actually do to themselves over time, look to Pitcairn Island, settled in 1790 by 9. Mutineers from the ship Bounty, along with a small group of Tahitian men and women who left with them. Really only a handful of men and women who went on to actually have children there. An entire community grew, isolated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean for generations, with limited outside contact for decades at a stretch. Genetic research on their present-day descendants still shows the imprint of that narrow founding group clearly, generations later, distinct maternal lineages traced back to the small number of founding Polynesian women. A Y chromosome record dominated by the handful of founding European men. The unmistakable genetic signature of a population that started too small and stayed too isolated for too long. It's a real, studied, human-scale preview of exactly the founder effect and genetic drift dynamics Chapter 4's population genetics research is built to guard against. Except Pitcairn had open ocean, and, eventually, passing ships as its only real barrier to contact. Not a sealed hull with the vacuum of space beyond it, and its population still never grew past a few dozen people at its smallest, dependent on occasional outside contact to remain viable at all. A generation ship is being asked to run the same experiment, deliberately, on purpose, at a population in the thousands instead of dozens, with no ocean anyone could eventually cross to reach them, and no passing ship to ever bring new blood, new ideas, or rescue. If the isolation curdles the way isolation has curdled before, in the one real precedent history has already given us. Given that gap between what's been tested and what the mission actually demands, the literature on multi-generational closed missions consistently points toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. An experiment at this scale and duration doesn't stay stable by accident or by goodwill alone, no matter how carefully the first generation is selected for temperament. It requires deliberate, sustained management, renewed by every generation in turn, of reproduction to protect the genetic minimum established in Chapter 4, without collapsing into coercion severe enough to fracture the population on its own, of labour and skill so that life-critical systems always have someone trained to maintain them, generation after generation, without a supply ship ever bringing a replacement specialist from outside, and of information and purpose itself, so that people born centuries after launch who never chose this mission and have every rational reason to eventually question it the way any thoughtful person questions an inherited obligation, still understand clearly enough why the ship's original goal is worth continuing to serve, or are given room to renegotiate what that goal even means without tearing the ship apart in the process. That last piece is the sharpest trade-off in the entire mission, and it deserves to be named directly instead of softened into something more comfortable. The more effectively a closed, multi-generation mission manages itself well enough to actually survive intact for centuries, the less it resembles the open, self-determining society that built and launched it in the first place. Freedom to dissent, freedom to choose a different path, freedom to simply opt out of the mission your great-great-grandparents signed you up for without ever asking you. All of that works directly against the kind of continuity the Voyage needs in order to succeed at all. A ship that preserved every one of those freedoms perfectly, uncompromised, generation after generation, would be more likely to fracture the way Biosphere 2's crew did at a scale with far higher stakes and, critically, no wall to rescue anyone through when it went wrong. A ship that suppressed those freedoms enough to guarantee continuity, on the other hand, would, by the time it arrived, barely resemble a free society at all, something closer to an institution that happened to also be a home. There isn't a clean answer sitting cleanly between those two poles. There's only a management problem that never stops, run continuously, by people who are themselves the products of whatever version of that management the generation before them settled on, inheriting not just the ship but the entire unresolved argument about how it should be run. Scholars who study the generation ship concept directly flag a specific version of this risk, clearly enough to have given it a name of its own, sometimes called, in that literature, the mutiny problem. It isn't about a single dramatic uprising, the kind a poster might depict. It's the quieter, more durable risk that a population born into a mission, rather than having chosen it, may, at some point, simply stop believing the destination is worth what continuing to reach it costs them, and may have both the numbers and the position to act on that belief, since unlike a ship's captain on Earth, There's no higher authority to appeal to, and no outside force capable of intervening either way. Whatever governance structure the ship settles into has to be robust enough to survive that possibility without either suppressing it so completely that the loss of freedom becomes its own kind of failure, or accommodating it so completely that the mission itself quietly stops. Holding a shared purpose across that many generations depends on something that sounds almost administrative next to everything else in this chapter, but turns out to matter just as much: the ship's own record of itself. Every law, every rationale, every account of why a given rule exists has to survive being copied, translated across however much the ship's own language, quietly drifts over centuries and reinterpreted by people reading it with no living memory of the world that produced it. The same apprenticeship and inheritance problem from Chapter 2's engineering systems applied now to the ship's entire body of law and history, instead of to a single machine. Societies on Earth solve a much smaller version of this problem constantly. And even there, founding documents get reinterpreted, disputed, and sometimes quietly reversed by later generations who read the same words and arrive at different conclusions than the people who wrote them intended. A generation ship doesn't get to fall back on an outside academic tradition, a wider culture, or a body of independent historians to keep that record honest. Whatever history and law survived the trip, or whatever the ship itself managed to carry forward, edited, consciously or not, by every generation that touched them along the way. Beyond the written record, the ship likely needs something less formal, doing some of the same work. Anniversaries, ceremonies, recurring markers of the launch date or the mission's founding purpose, repeated often enough and publicly enough that even people who never read the original archives absorb the shape of the mission simply by living inside its recurring calendar. Written law can be reinterpreted quietly by a small number of people in a back room. A shared, repeated, lived ritual is harder to reinterpret without everyone aboard noticing the change happening in real time, which makes it, however unglamorous it sounds next to the engineering in earlier chapters, one of the more durable tools available for keeping thousands of people across centuries still pointed at the same distant, unseen star. And somewhere inside that inherited chain, not at a single dramatic moment marked on a calendar, but gradually, the way most real change actually arrives, one unremarkable year at a time, the ship stops being a vehicle on its way to somewhere else. A generation is eventually born, raised, and grown to adulthood, having never known anything but the hull. No memory of Earth, no memory of the launch, no living relative left who personally remembers what any of this was originally for, beyond what they were told, second-hand or third-hand, in a story that's been retold enough times to have quietly changed shape. To that generation, the ship isn't a mode of transportation anymore, carrying them towards some future event they're counting down to. It's simply the world. The only one they've ever had, governed by whatever structure the centuries before them decided was necessary to keep everyone alive long enough to keep governing it at all, and inherited by them the same unquestioned way a native language is. None of this makes the mission doomed, and it's worth resisting the pull toward that conclusion just because the chapter has spent this long on what could go wrong. Human societies on Earth have held shared purpose, shared law, and shared identity across many centuries without a single sealed hull forcing the issue. Nations, religious traditions, and institutions that have outlasted any individual member by hundreds of years, adapting their own founding stories generation after generation while still recognizably continuing them. A generation ship asks for a harder, more concentrated version of something humanity has, in a looser and more forgiving form, already actually done. The honest claim isn't that governing a closed, multi-generational population is impossible. It's that everything this chapter has walked through, the mutiny risk, the drifting record, the freedom versus continuity trade, has to be actively managed the entire way by real people making real judgment calls rather than assumed to simply hold because the engineering elsewhere in the ship does. Go back, now, to the hatch, the one that closed behind you at the very beginning of this, with that soft pressure change sound, and the weight returning to your legs as the ring beneath you began to spin. That was you. That was your body, your decision, your name on the manifest, made with open eyes about everything this story has walked through since. Run the arithmetic from chapter 1 back through everything since, and one plain fact sits underneath all of it, impossible to engineer around. Whether the honest transit time lands closer to the 6,000-year hypothetical or the century-scale estimate from serious proposed propulsion, either number is enormously larger than a single human lifespan. Which means, categorically, without exception, in every version of this mission that respects the actual numbers involved, you do not arrive. Not probably won't, cannot, structurally, by the same arithmetic that made the mission necessary in the first place, back at the very start. The person standing at the hatch and the people who eventually step off this ship onto another world are not the same person. Not as a tragic twist arriving late in the story, but as the founding condition, true from the very first page, whether anyone at the launch ceremony said it out loud or not. Which means the first generation's actual story, the one this whole account keeps circling, ends the ordinary way. The way any human life ends, not in a dramatic sacrifice at some clearly marked turning point, but in old age, aboard, decades after the launch, in a ship still centuries from anywhere, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew Earth and great-grandchildren who never will either. There's no ceremony built into the physics for that moment. No version of the mission plan marks the death of the person who first felt the hatch seal as a milestone, the way it marks a system checkpoint or a rotation rate calibration. It happens the way it happens to everyone, on a ship or off one, and the mission simply continues afterward, carried forward by people who were children or not yet born when it did, which is, in its own quiet way, the clearest possible demonstration of everything this chapter has been building toward. The ship was never going to pause for you. It was built, from the very first calculation in chapter 1, to keep moving after you're gone, exactly as long as it takes. So sit with who actually does arrive. Because it's worth being precise about it instead of gesturing vaguely toward future generations the way a mission brochure might. The people who eventually reach the destination are descendants, some number of generations removed, shaped by everything the last 6 chapters just walked through, not as background detail but as the literal material they're made of. Body and mind both. Bodies adapted across a lifetime, or several lifetimes, to spin gravity and engineered light, rather than Earth's raw gravity and its actual sun. Bodies that, if the deconditioning documented in 6-month ISS missions is any honest guide, may need real, careful, possibly lengthy readaptation just to function under a new planet's different gravity once they arrive. The way returning astronauts do today, after a fraction of that time away, except with no Earth waiting patiently at the far end to help ease them back in, minds formed entirely by whatever governance structure the ship's closed society settled into in order to survive itself across centuries, carrying a mission purpose they inherited rather than chose, and which they have had every generation's worth of reasonable cause to question, reinterpret, or quietly redefine along the way, the same way any inherited belief gets reshaped by the people who actually have to live inside it. They may not want, on arrival, exactly what the original planners wanted. They may not even entirely recognize themselves in whatever founding documents, recorded speeches, or stated wishes the first generation left behind in the ship's archives. The same records Chapter 6 already warned would drift under the weight of translation, reinterpretation, and centuries of readers who never met the people who wrote them. Whatever you record at the hatch, on your first day aboard, meant as a message to the people who finally arrive, will reach them the way any old document reaches a much later reader, filtered through everything that happened to the ship, and to the idea of the mission in between. It might be treated as scripture. It might be treated as a historical curiosity, interesting but no longer binding. There is no way, standing at the hatch today, to control every message you might leave behind. A recorded speech, a letter addressed to whoever eventually reads it, a name chosen for the ship itself, meant to carry some piece of your own intention forward, is really a message to a stranger, sent across a gap of time so large that the person receiving it will have been shaped by everything this story has already walked through. Engineered light, inherited apprenticeship, a governance structure you'll never meet, a population you'll never know the names of. You can choose what you send. You cannot choose how it lands. They may, reasonably, arrive with their own ideas about what the mission now means, shaped by centuries none of the original planners lived to see. And they are, unmistakably, still real people, having a real and enormous experience of their own, just not your experience, and not the one you personally signed up to have. Standing at that hatch, there's a stranger wrinkle sitting underneath even that, one that has nothing to do with biology or governance, and everything to do with light itself, whatever the destination star system looks like from Earth today. However, the light from Proxima Centauri or any other candidate world is read and modelled by telescopes right now. That light already left the star years before it reached the instruments studying it, meaning today's best picture of that world is already, by definition, slightly out of date the moment anyone receives it. Add the centuries a real voyage would take on top of that existing lag, and the descendants who eventually arrive are approaching a system that hasn't been freshly observed in any real sense for longer than most human civilizations have lasted. Whatever changed in that system in the meantime, and stars and the space around them do change, simply isn't in anyone's data. The arriving generation isn't just meeting a world their distant ancestors chose sight unseen in any personal sense. They may be meeting a world that no longer entirely matches the last real look anyone ever got at it from Earth. Verified only once they're already close enough to see it for themselves, with no way to have checked from any further away, and no way to have turned back once the difference became clear. Which means the arriving generation's first real task isn't stepping outside at all. It's confirming, with their own instruments, up close, for the first time in the mission's entire history, whether the world they're approaching still matches even the ship's own centuries-old briefing well enough to be survivable. A verification step nobody aboard has ever had to perform before, using observational skills passed down through the same apprenticeship chain as everything else, about a subject none of their teachers ever got to check firsthand either. However carefully, Chapter 4's reproductive planning and Chapter 6's governance held the population together for the entire crossing, the actual decision to open the hatch on the other end still has to be made fresh, by people facing direct, present uncertainty their ancestors could only ever plan around in the abstract. Assume, for a moment, that the verification comes back clean, that the world really is close enough to what the ship's archives predicted, and the decision is made to actually go. What happens physically to the people who make that decision is its own quiet echo of everything. Chapter 5 already established about bodies shaped by the ship rather than by Earth. Whatever the new world's gravity actually is, it almost certainly isn't identical to the rim gravity a body has spent an entire lifetime adapting to, which means the deconditioning research from 6-month ISS missions, bone density down 1 to 2% a month in the absence of Earth's load, muscle mass down by 1/5 or more without daily countermeasure work, isn't a distant analogy anymore at the moment of arrival. It's a direct preview of what a body built entirely by shipboard gravity has to relearn in reverse under a completely different pull, with no return trip to a familiar gravity waiting to finish the readaptation the way it does for astronauts coming home today. The first people to actually stand on the new world may need to do so carefully, gradually, monitored by the ship's own medical archive, treating a walk outside less like a triumphant first step and more like a supervised physical therapy session, against a planet nobody aboard has ever personally tested their body against before. It's worth being precise, too, about who is actually present for that moment. Because it's easy, even after everything this story has walked through, to let the imagination quietly slip back toward a single hero standing at a hatch. It isn't one person, it's whatever fraction of a population in the thousands has, by that point in the mission, been born into a role connected to first contact with the new world. Pilots, biologists, engineers, assessing whether the ship's remaining systems can support a full disembarkation or only a cautious first survey. Carrying out a task their training prepared them for in the abstract, for their entire lives, without any of their teachers having lived to see whether that preparation was actually accurate. Whatever they feel in that moment, and it's reasonable to assume it includes something like the wonder the opening poster always promised, alongside everything else this story has added to it, belongs entirely to them. Nothing about their internal experience passes backward through time to the person who felt the hatch seal shut centuries earlier, at the very beginning of all of this. That's not a metaphor. It's the literal, structural truth the arithmetic in Chapter 1 was always pointing toward. There's a final possibility worth naming honestly, because the research behind this story doesn't pretend it away. Arrival might not mean immediate, full disembarkation at all, depending on what the ship's instruments actually find when they finally get close enough to look, on whether the atmosphere, the biochemistry, or the basic habitability of the target world matches centuries-old predictions closely enough to trust. The arriving generation may spend years in orbit around their destination before anyone sets foot on it, running exactly the kind of careful verification described above, this time with an entire population's future riding on getting it right. The ship that has been the only world anyone aboard has ever known might, for a while yet, remain exactly that, even after the destination is finally, physically, close enough to see out the window. And it's worth sitting, briefly, with the version of this story nobody puts on a poster at all. The possibility that verification doesn't come back clean, that whatever changed in the destination system during the centuries since the last real look from Earth, the very drift the light lag problem already flagged as unavoidable, turns out to have moved the target world outside the range the mission was actually built to survive in. There is no honest version of this story that promises that outcome away. A mission justified, in Chapter 1, entirely by the numbers, has to be honest, all the way to its final chapter, that the numbers describe a plausible destination generously supported by everything currently observable from Earth, not a guaranteed one. If that's what the arriving generation finds, the ship doesn't simply have a backup planet waiting nearby the way a delayed flight has an alternate airport. It has whatever the population and whatever remains of the ship's own resources after centuries of use can actually manage from there. A genuinely open question this story doesn't have the standing to answer with invented comfort, because nobody has ever actually made this trip to find out. What's certain, underneath every branch of that uncertainty, is the fact this whole chapter keeps circling back to. However, the arrival actually unfolds. Clean confirmation or unwelcome surprise, immediate disembarkation or years of cautious orbit. It happens to people who are not you, using judgment you didn't teach them personally, carrying a purpose you handed off and then, structurally, permanently, let go of. Whatever epitaph the first generation ever imagined for itself back at the hatch, the truest one turns out to be almost embarrassingly plain. They left so that someone else, eventually, might arrive. That's the actual, literal answer to the question this whole story opened with. And it's worth stating, without softening it any further, the payoff of a generation ship, the moment of stepping onto a new world beneath a new star, was never something the ship was carrying you toward. It's something the ship was carrying your absence toward. You get the departure. You get the recalibration of your own body to a spinning, engineered world that was never quite Earth. You get, if you're fortunate, a handful of decades helping to build and stabilize the sealed civilization that has to survive long enough to eventually finish a job you only ever began. What you don't get, ever, under any honest version of the numbers this story has walked through, is the ending. The ship was never carrying a passenger to a destination. It was carrying a civilization to its own reinvention. And you are only ever present for the very first draft of it. However long your own life inside that draft happens to run, come back one last time to the hatch. The soft pressure change, the weight returning to your legs as the ring beneath you spins up, the air already shared, already breathed by strangers before you and strangers after, longer than your name is going to last being spoken by anyone still alive to speak it. That image was never just an opening. It was the actual answer, the whole time, to the question this was built to ask. What would you experience, really, during a generation ship's journey to another star system? Not the wonder of a new sky, because you will never see it, no matter how the math is arranged. Not the relief of arrival, because arrival belongs, by the very math that made this mission necessary in the first place, to someone else entirely. Someone who shares your bloodline and your ship's name, and very little else about how they actually see the world. What you actually experience is the part that happens before all of that. The recalibration of a body built for one planet into a body that has to survive for the rest of its life on engineered gravity and borrowed air. The slow, generation by generation tightening of a society that has no choice but to organize itself around its own survival. Because there is no outside, no rescue, no wall with a desert on the far side of it waiting to let outside oxygen back in, and underneath both of those, the quiet, unglamorous, entirely real work of handing a purpose you will never see completed to people who didn't choose it any more than you chose the century you were born into, and trusting. Not knowing, only ever trusting. That they'll carry it far enough to finish what you only ever got to begin. None of the numbers behind that answer were invented for effect. They're the same numbers this story has carried since the very first chapter. A real spacecraft that, after nearly 50 years of flight, still hasn't crossed a single light year. A real closed habitat that couldn't hold its own oxygen for 2 years. With rescue sitting right outside the wall. A real, small, isolated human population whose founding handful of ancestors is still visible in its descendants' genes generations later. This was never a story that needed exaggeration to feel enormous. The real arithmetic already is. Every hard trade-off this story walked through, shielding mass against propulsion speed, redundancy against weight, individual freedom against collective survival, a written record against a living, drifting memory, showed up because there was no way around it. Not because the story needed conflict. That's the difference between a generation ship as a dramatic device and a generation ship as an actual engineering and biological proposal. The drama isn't added on top of the numbers. It's what the numbers turn into. Once you follow them all the way through to the people who'd actually have to live inside them. A propulsion ceiling forces generational crewing. Generational crewing forces a population in the thousands. A population that size forces reproductive planning, and centuries of isolation force some form of continuous governance, and both of those together force a record of the mission's own purpose that has to survive its own translation across time. Nothing was added to make the story bigger. Everything was already implied the moment the first chapter established that no one alive at the hatch would ever see the other end. That's not a smaller story than the one the poster promises. It might be a truer one. The generation ship was never really a form of transportation. The way a plane or a ship at sea is transportation. A way of moving a person from one place to another, intact, to personally experience the place they were headed. It's something closer to a species making a deliberate, permanent decision. To become, on purpose, with open eyes and full knowledge of the arithmetic, the ancestors of people they will never meet in service of a destination they will never personally see. You don't get to be the traveler in that story, whatever the poster on the wall of the boarding hall suggested. You get to be its origin, and whether that's a smaller thing to be than the person who arrives, or an entirely different, harder, more honest kind of large, that's the question this was always actually asking you to sit with. Long after the hatch has closed behind you, somewhere out past the edge of what any of our instruments have ever confirmed, that answer either gets tested for real one day, or it doesn't. Either way, the arithmetic that produced it doesn't need the mission to actually launch in order to already be true. It was true the moment Proxima Centauri's light first left its star, 4.22 years before it ever reached a telescope on Earth. It's true right now, in the gap between where Voyager 1 currently is and where the nearest star still sits, patiently, on the other side of a distance nearly 50 years of continuous flight still hasn't closed. And it would still be true on the day any real hatch like the one this story opened with finally sealed shut. For the first time. For real. Not because the story demanded it, but because that's simply what the numbers, followed all the way through, have been describing the entire time.